Hi everyone, and thank you, Nora. I'm Baudouin Forgeot. I'm going to be the chair of the session, and we're gonna, this prize is a way to recognize the huge work accomplished by Franck. I think he's here, but it's a bit odd because all the chairs are empty, as you can see, because all of our panelists, except me, are online. So I'm going to start by I won't make a biography of Franck Ramus in the conventional sense, because I know that all the panelists that are here, they all very gladly accepted to participate to this symposium, because all of them said they had nice things to say about Franck. So you're gonna hear that along the symposium. Myself, as a former graduate student of Franck at the LSCP, Lab of Cognitive Science and Psycholinguistics in Paris a few years ago. I had the very great opportunity to have Franck Ramus as a mentor. So I'm going to start with a few words about, showing you the overview of the symposium. I'm going to talk personally about Franck as an inspiration for the physician and the scientist. Valérie de Simone is gonna, on behalf of the Fédération Française des 10, the 10 disorders French Federation, is gonna talk about these disorders in France. And then Marie Lallier, who is also a cognitive scientist, is going to talk about heterogeneity of the neurocognitive basis of developmental dyslexia that builds a lot on the work done by Franck. And Dominique Yvon, who is a physicist, not many of them among the speakers at this conference, is going to talk about the case of autism in France and why Franck Ramus is a driving force for progress. And then we'll hear Franck, who's going to talk about a lot of his inspirations and research. I hope we'll keep time. I'm going to try to keep the pace to have time for a general discussion at the end of the session. So I'm going to start by saying personally that for me, as a physician and a scientist, Franck, since we met, has always been an inspiration. I spent 4 years at the lab with him, and he was always asking, and he was always asking and challenging. And for those who know him, Franck, he's able to ask a tough question to anyone. I didn't see him stopped by political correctness, so it's really refreshing, and it's really refreshing. He was also a trusting and supporting mentor, and he followed up on some of my ideas, although I was just a young student, and I was also very impressed by the way he was able to model and mentor my first steps in experimenting and writing and so on. So he made me, I would say, more than, there was a reference to something my director, the director of my medical department said the day of my dissertation defense. She said, "Oh, so Dr. Forgeot, you're now half a scientist and half a physician." And then Franck answered, "I don't know for the physician's side, but I think he's not half, he's a full scientist." So that was, as I said, not the first time I heard Franck contradicting someone in public, but that was maybe the first time I heard him saying something nice that might not have been 100% true at that time. So I wanted to emphasize on the kind of problem that I think can have Franck's interest, like talking about autism, which is one of his topics of interest, a threshold problem that we encounter in the clinical day-to-day life. Because Franck is a cognitive scientist, but he always had an interest for the way things are going the hospital or for patients, for people who live with the conditions he was interested in. For example, this threshold problem, I could say that when you put a diagnostic, almost everyone agrees that autism is not a yes or no condition. It's more like a continuum. But nevertheless, when we do diagnostic, we tend to choose whether there is a diagnostic or no diagnostic. So we dichotomize the situation. And then this has a huge impact on access to services and even in understanding, curiously, even in understanding of the situation. And this also has, this fact has a huge importance on the cost of the procedure. Because it's quite easy to differentiate between prototypical cases of autism and non-autistic people, but the gray zone is really important, and the cost and probably the stress for people and the difficulties for the system are really huge in every system that tries to dichotomize in this kind of continuum. So that was the kind of question I wanted to use this opportunity to talk with Franck. I think he can hear me now. And the other situation I wanted to emphasize is the one with subthreshold. As you see, these people here, they might have a certain level of needs and symptoms, but nevertheless, they don't have access to service. And more curiously, they tend to be understood as different. How many parents would say, oh, if my kid doesn't have this diagnostic, that means I'm a bad parent. And professionals, they feed in that narrative when they say, okay, when they describe subdiagnostic situations, sometimes with alternate explanatory theories like attachment disorder. So that's something maybe Franck might be interested to go in the next few years. I would skip that one, but it was just an example of further work, further understanding of autism I did after the work I did with Franck. And this one is also, we worked, Franck and I worked on understanding theory of mind as an aspect of possibly the way to understand autism. And I just want to take that example of how it can be understood, not necessarily just as a deficit in autistic people, but as a computational approach was effective in showing an alternative way, sorry for that, an alternative way autistic people might use to adapt in social behavioral situations, such as simple children's games. At the end of this talk, I just want very briefly, I just want to say that what I learned with Franck was an inspiration and a way to try to solve problems. And what happens now is when I face a situation of problem solving, I tend to try to use a little Franck in my mind and say, what would Franck think about that, which is a kind of theory of mind. So thank you, Franck, for that. And that's it. Thank you for your attention. And now we switch to the online next part. I think we won't have questions now, but we will have the presentations one after the other and keep the questions for the end. As I said, Franck would be the last speaker. So now I'm very happy to introduce Valérie de Simone, who's, I don't know if she can hear me. Marie, are you ready to present? Okay,
yes,
great.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you very well,
yeah.
And we see your presentation, so thank you, Marie.
Okay, so thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for the invitation, and congratulations, Franck, again for this prize, really deserved, well deserved. So today I want to talk about research that has been inspired somehow by Franck's work, and is about the heterogeneity of the neurocognitive basis of developmental dyslexia. So Franck's work in dyslexia is actually, if you work on dyslexia, you're going to come across Franck's work for sure. And it has been really fundamental and pioneer in many aspects that I hope I'm going to show throughout this talk. So understanding the causes of developmental dyslexia and why there is such a huge heterogeneity in the associated neurocognitive symptoms has been the objective of research for decades. And several theories have emerged, and sometimes these theories are strongly disagreeing with one another. And Franck's work has been really fundamental in trying to clarify this messy picture, which is very objective mind and perspective on things. And basically what is done was assessing in the same individual, dyslexic individual, the leading theories. And what he found in his paper in 2003, which was really influential, I think, was that all the cases of dyslexic individuals had a phonological deficit, which was or wasn't associated with other type of sensory motor deficits. So this really, Franck's work really stressed the importance of the phonological deficit in the explanation of dyslexia, but this doesn't necessarily mean that there couldn't be any other potential deficits in these other areas that could cause dyslexia, and also that these disorders could be found in absence of phonological deficits. And in this talk, I want to show data supporting a multifactorial approach of the neurocognitive causes of dyslexia, which Franck's work has recently informed, and I'm going to talk a little bit about it. And so that hypothesis suggests that there is at least two distinct cognitive subtypes of dyslexia, one linked to the phonological deficit and another one linked to a visual attention span deficit that I'm going to define in the next slide. So the phonological deficit is referring to difficulties at identifying, accessing, and manipulating speech sounds. And one also of important work that Franck has done within this field is that he found that the accessing to the speech sound are play potentially a stronger role than in the manifestation of phonological deficit in dyslexia. And so why a phonological deficit would cause problems at reading, because if this phonological acquisition is not done well during the early stages of language acquisition, then at the onset of reading acquisition, children would have these problems at mapping letters into their sounds, which would then lead to new word or sublexical decoding deficits. So on the opposite, the visual attention span deficit hypothesis suggests that a visual attention span reduction, so a reduction which is defined as a reduction in the number of visual elements that can be identified simultaneously in a multi-element array. So this type of deficit would be linked to problems in building up word-specific orthographic knowledge that would contribute greatly to whole word and lexical reading. So some work, and I'm going to show you some of Franck's work, also have shown support for this dissociation at the cognitive and at the neural level. So here I'm going to show you two neuroimaging studies in support of the dissociation, one from our group and one from a recent one from Franck's group. And so in this first study, what we did is we measured the visual attention span performance and the phonological performance of skilled reader adults in the scanner. And we found that visual attention span performance was associated with the activation of superior parietal lobules. On the opposite, phonological performance activated a network including the left infrafrontal gyrus and supramarginal gyrus, which suggests then two distinct neural networks explaining these two types of performance. And we tested two dyslexic patients with very similar severity and their reading deficits, but very different profiles. So patient FG showed a severe visual attention span deficit, but a preserved phonological skills. Whereas patient LL showed a very strong phonological deficit, but preserved visual attention span skills. And when we looked at the activation of the brain of these patients whilst performing a phonological task, we show that only the patient LL with a strong phonological deficit showed an hypoactivation of the networks that was highlighted in skilled readers. On the opposite, only FG show a hypoactivation of the network subtending the visual attention span performance. So this case of double dissociation is really strongly supporting these distinct neurocognitive subtypes in dyslexia. And recently, Franck's work has given more support to this because he's conducted some work showing that it's also the white matter connectivity network that seem to be contributing to that dissociations, with an occipital parietal networks associated with visual attention span performance, and temporoparietal occipital plus frontal networks associated with phonological performance in dyslexic children. So, taking a different perspective also of this dissociation, my work, and I think Franck is also interested in these questions, took a different approach, looking at a possible dissociation between the temporal dimensions of attentional processes that are involved in reading acquisition that would help us also understand better the nature of this dissociation and these two cognitive subtypes of dyslexia. So the visual attention span hypothesis stresses the importance of this simultaneous attentional distribution over the letter streams. But the phonological deficits, so during phonological acquisition, the sequential processing, attentional processing is taxed a lot because the phonological acquisition relies on the perception of millions of utterances of speech, acoustic speech waves during the early stages of language acquisition. And speech waves are basically a sequence of amplitude changes. So it is reasonable to think that a fast and precise sequential attentional shifting on at least some of these modulations should contribute to the phonological deficit in dyslexia. And we see that this is a more recent line of research that Franck's work really contributed to. So in order to show that this sequential attentional shifting would be only associated to this phonological deficit in dyslexia, but not to this visual attention span deficit, I'm going to just show you an example with this study that we've conducted with the stream segregation paradigm, so that you can have a little idea of what it is. So in this paradigm, participants listen to sequences of tones alternating in frequency, high pitch and low pitch tones. So if the interstimuli interval is long enough, we assume that attention can shift fast enough between two successive stimuli in order to perceive, and what we perceive is one stream composed of high and low pitch tones, like so. I don't know if you're gonna be able to listen to that. I hope you could hear, yeah. And if this ISI is sufficiently reduced, then we assume that attention cannot shift fast enough between two successive stimuli, and now we start perceiving one stream of high pitch and one stream of low pitch sounds, tones simultaneously, leading to the phenomenon of stream segregation, like so. So with an adaptive paradigms, varying the ISI based on the participant answer as to whether they perceived one or two streams, we can calculate a stream segregation threshold, which basically indexes the fastest attentional speed, shifting speed of participants. And remember that a higher threshold would correspond to a sluggish or slower attentional shifting speed. So we took this paradigm and tested 9 dyslexic adults with phonological difficulties at the individual level, confirming like the work that this is something in dyslexia, but also 9 dyslexic adults without phonological difficulties at the individual levels. And importantly, these two groups had a very similar severity in their reading skills and also a similar visual attention span deficit at the group level. And what we found is that on the group with a phonological disorder showed a higher threshold, meaning sluggish attentional shifting skills compared to the other groups. And interestingly, and I think this is also something that Franck is really interested about, and his research showed that this is fundamental to look at inter-individual differences in the dyslexic population. So we could show that sluggish attentional shifting could classify quite well for this small sample that we had, the participants with a phonological disorders, which would be here. going to skip that part. But now the question would be, okay, how this sluggish attentional shifting speed will contribute to the phonological deficit in dyslexia. And maybe it's interesting to look at what are the attentional markers in speech, because phonological acquisition is based on speech perception. And in speech, syllabic stress is one of the attentional markers that can attract attention because it's longer, louder, and higher in pitch than any other speech units. And it guides attention to facilitate word segmentations in infants, it has been shown. It is also encoded in the prosodic envelope of speech, which is in green here, and the syllabic envelope of speech, which is in light blue here. So basically, these reasons correspond to changes in amplitude that occur up to 8 times in a second. And in the past decades, Franck's work and many other work has really dived into these aspects, and it has been shown that the brain tracks and synchronizes with this amplitude, this speech envelope. So if this cortical tracking of speech drive this attentional shifting over the stress units, and if this attentional shifting is related to phonological deficits in dyslexia, then we should see that phonological deficits in dyslexia are associated with an atypical and asynchronous cortical tracking of speech or synchronization to speech. And this is what we found in a study where we use magnetoencephalography, where we computed basically the correlation between the speech envelope and the response of the brain to the speech envelope. See how they looked alike. And what we could show is first that the brain correlates, or the brain responses resembles a lot the prosodic envelope. You can see a high correlation here, and the syllabic envelope, a high correlation here. But only in the delta band, the prosodic envelope, we saw a reduction of synchronization in the dyslexic group compared to the controls, which was present, this reduction of synchronization in the right auditory cortex and the left inferior frontal gyrus. And importantly, we could show that it was the propagation of the synchronization in the right hemisphere that was to the left hemisphere that was impaired in dyslexia and could explain their phonological performance. So far, there has been many studies looking at this type of hypothesis, looking at atypical synchronization to speech and non-speech stimuli across various frequencies. And there is a really recent reviews from Franck's lab that was really nice in just gathering all the information. And as usual, I think in Franck's work, just pointing out what are the limitation, methodological, theoretical limitation of this type of work, which is a very hot topic at the moment in the research of dyslexia. So I really, this work was really important. So I think that I showed some data that support this multifactorial hypothesis of dyslexia and can explain part of the heterogeneity of the disorder. And obviously it has strong implication for diagnosis and remediation, which is something always that Franck has always looked for. In the end, now the ultimate goal of this all theoretical research of dyslexia would be to be able to apply that to useful topics for the patients and the individuals with dyslexia. But I don't know if I have time, but I would like to just say that there is also another line of Franck's work that is important in order to explain the heterogeneity of dyslexia, which is not related to the distinct cognitive subtype, but also to the differences across languages on their structures. Because we know that the languages are not the same, and they may modulate the severity and the prevalence of the visual attention span or the phonological deficits in dyslexia. And one of the most studied aspects or feature of orthographies is the consistency of letter sound correspondences. And Franck's work with a huge consortium of collaborators shows that actually some of these deficits in dyslexia may be exacerbated in inconsistent orthographies like English or French, for example. And to finish, I would like also to say that there is another aspect, really, again, inspired by Franck's work, which is a linguistic reason that differs across languages, and that may modulate the contribution of this cortical tracking of the speech modulation to reading acquisition. And this could depend, so varying across languages, this can depend on the rhythmic class of languages. Some languages are syllable time, other languages are stress time, and this really has been showed in the very Franck's work in 1999, 2002, and other years. And there is another aspect also that may be very important to take into account, which is the predictability of lexical stress, which you can see in English or in Spanish, for example. The stress is not fixed, it's variable, and children have to encode the position of that stress within words. Whereas in French, for example, this lexical stress is super predictable, it's at the end. So lexical stress may play a different role in reading acquisition and dyslexia, and explain some of the heterogeneity of the disorder. So just a last word, just to say that all these studies of the heterogeneity of dyslexia and the cause of dyslexia, I think Franck's work really inspired also my work, because the few times I met Franck in conferences, he was always so objective in trying to find out why there is such heterogeneity, the methodological problem, theoretical options, always in a very objective, a skeptical, I think, way, which is very, I think, important to conduct research in that field. So thank you, Franck. Thank you, everyone. And yeah, thank you for your attention.
Merci, Marie. Thank you. Our next speaker is Dominique Yvon. Are you ready, Dominique? Whenever you are.
So my name is Dominique Yvon. I'm a physicist, a particle physicist, father of 3 young adults with autism. I wrote this slide with the support of Magali Lallier, Magali Pignard, and Laetitia Colliot. And I want to talk about the case of autism in France and why Franck Ramus is a driving force for progress. So the case of autism in France. 15 years ago, while my family was looking for a diagnosis for a 3-year-old child, speechless, we were first told not to worry. Your child will decide himself when he wants to talk. My family did insist and was sent to hospital, where a somatic genetic epilepsy checkup happened and showed no problem. Then the psychiatrist said, I won't place a diagnosis before 6 years old. I suggest that the mother undergo psychoanalysis. The therapy proposed for the nonverbal child was half an hour lying on a couch, twice a week with a psychoanalyst, waiting for the emergence of desire to speak. Had we go on with them, our son would have been sent to hospital for children, where he would have received no education, and in the end would have spent his whole lifetime in a psychiatric hospital under heavy medication. At that time and before that time, many people, family associations, few therapists and scientists were publicly fighting for progress. In 2004, Autism Europe, an association, sued the French government, and this led to a condemnation of France by the Council of Europe for lack of proper education, schooling, and professional training for people with autism. The next year, a book was published in France, Le Livre Noir de la Psychanalyse, with 40 contributions, questioning psychoanalysis relevance in autism and other contexts. The same year, the first national action plan for autism was filed by the French government with low funding but welcome, and all this pushed the government to request from agency to write recommendations for good professional practice for people with autism. So this happened first in 2010, then in 2012, where based on a formalized consensus and international science result, more than 1,000 papers were evaluated and these recommendations were published. So since 2010 in France, recommendations for autism healthcare are known and publicly advertised. And if I summarize them very quickly, autism healthcare should focus on education in the broadest sense. The point is that most psychiatrists and paramedic unions have been actively fighting this recommendation. In 2012, the collective of the 39 formed, and in next year, they filed a petition requesting cancellation of the third National Action Plan, promoting the implementation of good practice in autism healthcare in France. Just for you to know, more than 2,000 French psychiatrists signed this petition, most, if not all, psychologists union and all French psychoanalysts association. This opposition is led by psychoanalyst leaders. Is that cognitive dissonance? I think so. For sure, also, they don't want to lose their prestigious position. For sure, also, they make a lot of money funded by public healthcare, and they are supported by intensive public promotion of their dogma. In France, psychoanalysts publish a wide audience book each week in France. At the same time, a petition was filed by Association of Family with Autism, supporting good practice in autism healthcare. Just for you to know, only 12 French psychiatrists dare signing this petition. For sure, there are more than 12 good psychiatrists in France, but this shows the pressure of the unions on this professional. So 12 years after that, most professionals in France still do not apply agency good practice recommendation. The point is, recommended practice are not mandatory to be funded. Of course, exceptions do exist, and these good professionals are overwhelmed by workload. Why such a fact? Many professionals have never been or do not want to be trained. Some of them have been trained, but they claim that recommendations are too far from their theoretical framework. I strongly believe that better training is the key for a better future in our country. It turns out the psychiatrist training has been partially updated a few years ago, and we can hope that within 10 years, this part of the professional will be improved, I would say. But other clinical professional training are still locked by psychoanalysis dogma in France. Psychologists and educators are trained in humanities university in France, and these humanities mostly don't care much about science. Thus, family patients need the support of scientists to make science understood by the widest public, to push the French government for an update of the professional training content. As a summary, most professionals involved in autism healthcare have not been properly trained in France. Good professionals do exist. They are not enough. They're not enough. Yeah. Progress exists, but it is still slow. Psychoanalysis dogma is still dominant in most university professional clinical training. Professional training is today the biggest problem. Clinical psychology, educators, speech language pathologists, and teachers, which are very important for children, are not properly trained on the topic of neurodevelopmental disorders. The different governments did not address this problem efficiently yet. They are under strong pressure of dogmatic unions, and the government still today fund outdated healthcare. Thus, 4 additional condemnation of France by the Council of Europe happened since then on the same issues. Scientists are needed to explain publicly international science results and to support family demands for up-to-date healthcare. That's what Franck Ramus does. On the wide audience science-based communication, he maintained a good website with a link is here. And to summarize very shortly its content, last year, Franck has given 15 interviews to radio or newspaper. And since 2007, he gave more than 130 more. And you can download most of them for the website. He also wrote 80 papers for wide audience and professionals. These papers are self-standing or are included in books. 80 papers since 1999. This shows intensive long-term activity. I want to point out its blog, wide audience blog named Ramus. You have the link here. And inside, for example, you will find a video library. And these are the topics treated in this video, or movies, I would say. You see autism, education, genetics, intelligence, medicine and evidence-based practice, science, cognitive science, sex and gender, neurodevelopmental disorder. A large diversity of topics are explained and documented, and I can testify that this blog content is commonly used as a reference for autism militant in France. Focusing on the topic I'm more involved in, Franck works actively on explaining scientific knowledge on learning disabilities, other disabilities, cognitive development of the child. He dares facing outdated dogma on neuromism in France. It advocates for implementation of evidence-based pedagogy, effectiveness of teaching method, information and training of teachers in this approach. He is an active member of the National Education Scientific Council, and he led the teams that built a MOOC, Psychology for Teachers. You have the link here, and more than 7,000 people received Certificate of Achievement last year on this MOOC. He's also advocating for good professional practice of autistic people. He has been involved in many public and many more confidential actions. We met in Collectif du 16 Janvier in 2012, where he was involved in listing, marking French training course, bad ones, better ones, good ones. We have the link here. He was also involved in writing an open letter to the French president in order to support the third action plan, autism. He also was involved in writing an article in a wide audience book on autism, à la découverte de l'autisme. He was a member of the preparatory meetings for the fourth autism plan in France. He also co-organized a one-day information and training on the topic of psychiatry and psychology based on science. On this one-day training, young psychiatrists were invited, and many of them discovered, I would say, science-based psychiatry and psychology at this meeting. He wrote many notes to public policy coordinators on other people less visible, but we take decisions about autism in France. He dares publicly question the priors of the dogma and the foundation of the consequence of their practice. You have here 4 links on open letter he wrote to people which were publishing crap, I would say. And I'm not aware of any of them replying to this to these open letters. He also spent time giving courses to lawyers, journalists, in order to help them make a better work. So as a summary, Franck is a very active scientist in promoting science results in real life. He dares facing strong opposition deeply rooted in the society when useful. He is very generous of his time, altruistic. So he is very busy, he is still accessible. He is a good teacher. He is very rigorous in the content of his talk, and he is committed. And for all of this, sincèrement, merci pour tout ça. I'm done.
Thank you, Dominique. And now, last but not least, I'm happy to welcome Franck for the last talk of this symposium. Thank you, Franck, and nice to see you.
Hi, everyone. Can you see me and hear me? Okay, it looks okay on my side. Okay, thank you very much, Baudouin, for putting this together, and thank you to all the previous speakers. So I am absolutely delighted to be here with you and to receive this prize. It's a great honor for me. First, I'd like to apologize for not being here with you in Toronto. The reason is that I'm somewhere lost in the South Pacific at this time, very far from home and very far from Toronto, and it was just impossible for me to do the round trip for this conference. I would have loved to be there, but thus we arranged this Zoom meeting. Jeff Elman and my relationship with him, I'm very honored to receive a prize named after him. I did not have the advantage of knowing him personally, but I can certainly say that he influenced me a great deal. and in particular through his book that Nora mentioned before, Rethinking Innateness, which was published in 1996, which was right at the start of my PhD. And it was a big event for me. I should say that I was raised in a lab where we were really in a nativist tradition. And so people like Jeff Elman and Liz Bates and colleagues were seen as kind of opponents. But this was a very fruitful opposition. So that like the two sides were adopting very strong positions that were easy to criticize. And of course, we kept criticizing each other's positions. And it was very interesting to see over the years that the positions became closer and closer. And certainly this book participated in that process. And for me, it really drove me to really think much harder about what it means for something to be innate, what it means for something to be genetically encoded, and what kind of information can be actually genetically encoded. And so this was featured in that book, but also in a series of articles featuring Jeff Elman and also his opponents. So I was a very attentive reader of all these debates at that time in the late 1990s, and this really shaped my thinking for my entire career. So for this, I'm really grateful to Jeff Elman. So now, since we're talking about the origins, of course, I need to credit my mentors. First, my PhD advisor, Jacques Meller, who was one of the pioneers of the study of infant cognition in the early 70s. And also of the study of language acquisition. And this is where I started studying infant speech perception, and in particular, the perception of rhythm by infants and what this might afford them for the bootstrapping of language acquisition. And then I went on to study dyslexia with Ute Frith, and this move from early language acquisition to dyslexia research was motivated by the search of a pathological model of language acquisition, which at that time I thought that dyslexia might be. And as we know, a pathological model is always a very fruitful strategy. And so I want to mention those mentors, not only because they trained me, quite obviously, but because they really played a very strong role in shaping my early career in their mentoring style, in the way they really helped me get in touch with the right people, supported me in all these early steps in my career, and even later, they were really exemplary mentors. So thank you, Jacques and Uta. Okay, so next I'm going to talk a little about my work. And of course, I cannot cover everything, but I have to start with this study that Marie already mentioned, because this was the study that really got me started in dyslexia research. And as she already partly explained, this emerged from my, as I got into dyslexia research, I started by a literature review, of course, and I was really puzzled by this literature review because every paper seemed to have a different theory of dyslexia. There was a profusion of theories, and every paper attempted to test their own theory by designing an experiment that would test the predictions of this theory and only this theory. And therefore, there were zillions of papers that seemed to support zillions of theories, and this did not make sense at all. And so bringing a fresh and external eye to this literature, I thought, well, this cannot go on forever. I mean, at some point, people must consider the theories of others and try to test those theories against each other. Out to do. And so I considered the four main theories of dyslexia, or the 5 main theories of dyslexia, which are listed here on the left-hand side. And I designed a study which would test the predictions of all these theories simultaneously against each other within the same individuals, which led me to construct a 10-hour test battery, which was, of course, administered in many sessions. Administered to groups of dyslexic and control individuals. And so the idea was not necessarily to try and support just one theory as the single cause of dyslexia for everybody, but just to try and see what theory of dyslexia may be able to explain what cases of dyslexia. And so in that study, it turned out that I looked at the individual data. So here is the performance of the control group and the normal range delimited by this dashed line. So in this study, we found that almost all of our dyslexic participants had a deficit in phonological skills. And some of them also had deficits in visual skills, in auditory skills, or in cerebellar motor skills, but not so many. And so, in fact, there seemed to be one potentially universal explanation for all these cases, which would be a phonological deficit. And then some other deficits that seemed to be associated with dyslexia, but that didn't seem to be really necessary to cause it. So this was my first attempt at answering the question of the causes of dyslexia. And so when you put all this information together, you can see that all the dyslexics had a phonological deficit, and a subset of them had an auditory deficit, a small subset had a visual deficit, and a small subset had a cerebellar deficit. And so this helps you see the sort of heterogeneity of profiles in dyslexia. So this was my first study in support of a phonological deficit. And it turns out that it went out to become the most cited study of dyslexia over the last 20 years. And of course, this is a single study on a relatively small sample. And of course, we went on to replicate this study on children on various groups. I'd like to mention this one, which I really like, and I think it's a bit underrated. We ran a similar study comparing not only dyslexic and control participants, but also autistic participants. Why did we do that? Because I noticed that there was not only a magnocellular theory of dyslexia, there was also a magnocellular theory of autism. There was not only a cerebellar theory of dyslexia, there was also a cerebellar theory of autism. And so I was left wondering, okay, but if this deficit is supposed to cause reading disability, and the same deficit is supposed to cause autistic spectrum disorder, I mean, does this mean that dyslexia and autism are the same? I mean, how can these theories be consistent? And so I thought, okay, we're going to test all these theories again, both in people with dyslexia and in people with autism. And the second interest was that we know that within autism, there are some very good readers, normal readers, and some poor readers. And so I wanted to see whether those who had the magnocellular deficit or the auditory or the cerebellar deficit would be the ones who would become poor readers. And so, as it turned out, we found that basically every possible case existed. We found some children with dyslexia with some sensory or motor deficits, but some without. And similarly, we found some children with autism with sensory motor deficits and some without. And this did not match at all the pattern of whether they were reading disabled or not. So there seemed to be a complete double dissociation between reading ability and those sensory motor skills that were presumed to be the cause of reading disability, which you can see by looking at certain profiles of specific cases. So like on this left-hand column, you can see 3 cases with dyslexia who have a very severe reading disability and who have perfectly normal or above normal performance in all the sensory motor domains. And this contrast, this doubly dissociates with 3 cases of autism who have perfectly normal or excellent reading ability, despite having very severe deficits in those sensory motor domains. So I concluded from this study that there's a complete double dissociation between those sensory motor skills and reading ability, and that those sensory motor skills are neither necessary nor sufficient to cause dyslexia as well as autism. Now to go on to a slightly other topic, after about 10 years of studies on the cognitive underpinnings of dyslexia, I was of course interested to move into brain research and to look for the neural basis of dyslexia. And in particular, I was interested in neural anatomy. And I was inspired by a whole body of work, which used mostly voxel-based morphometry studies at that time, and which in reviews, it looked really very good. It showed that there were a number of cortical regions whose gray matter volume seemed to significantly differ between groups of dyslexic and control individuals. So I set out to set up my own brain imaging study of dyslexia, and I thought I would do it a bit bigger than the previous ones and a bit better, and so we expected to replicate the same results and even to find even more results. And what we found was actually this. We found absolutely nothing, not one single significant difference between control and dyslexic children in voxel-based morphometry, even though we had a larger sample size than other people. And so we were a bit distressed and surprised. And at that time, it was a bit difficult to publish null results, so we kept these results in the drawer until several years later, my postdoc, Kasia Jednorok, she went back to Poland. She carried out her own study, imaging study of dyslexia, and we pooled her data, my data, and also data from a German collaborator together to make the biggest possible study of the neuroanatomy of dyslexia across 3 countries and 236 individuals. And so we ran again the VBM analysis of all those brains. And we found, well, not nothing, but just one single significant cluster in the left thalamus. And we were left wondering what this meant. And so we had 2 options for the paper: either build a story around the thalamus finding, or build a story around all the null results that we had in the cortex. Basically, this was a massive failure to replicate all the previous VBM studies that were published on dyslexia. And so I decided to take the latter option and to emphasize the lack of replication in our paper. And fortunately, it was eventually accepted. And so I'm mentioning all this because this was my first step into the replication crisis. It's one thing to hear about it, to read about it, but it's another thing to actually experience it as you fail to replicate previous studies that you trusted. And it was really eye-opening for me. And so I went on to review this area of the literature to understand what was going on. I was inspired by a paper by John Ioannidis, which looked at the number of significant clusters obtained in VBM studies as a function of the sample size of the study. And so, of course, you expect an increasing relationship, because the larger the sample size, the greater the statistical power, and therefore the higher the chances of observing significant differences. And what we observed is here on this graph, and it's just the opposite, which is that the larger the study on dyslexia, and the fewer the number of significant clusters that are reported, with basically no one significant cluster reported in the largest studies published. And as you can see, the literature is full of very small scale studies that report lots of significant findings. And this is a very sure sign that this literature is just full of false positive results, possibly due to p-hacking, possibly due to publication bias, and so on. So again, this was an eye-opener for me. And this led me into the area of open science, basically. This led me to change the practices in my lab, and where now we are pre-registering all of our projects before carrying them out. Yeah, this has been a real trigger in my career to understand all the limitations of our research practices and try and move on and promote better research practices. Which is, by the way, also something that I did as a teacher, as the head of a master's program in cognitive science. I've been the head of this program for 9 years now. I mean, most of my job was just managing day-to-day things, but one of the few things that I'm really proud of as the head of this master program was to require all the students to pre-register their final research projects. which at that time was a little revolution. And of course, we had to provide training for that, for them to learn how to pre-register a study. And but we were happy that we were kind of training the next generation of researchers to adopt better practices. And at the same time, I was also keen on educating their supervisors, because they had to pre-register their project, but usually their supervisors in other laboratories did not know how to do that. And so by having their students having to do that, basically we were kind of educating the rest of the community, so having a kind of diffuse influence. Okay, so now let's move on to another topic which I'm very interested in, which is genetics. And again, this came originally from this book, Rethinking Innateness. And another particular event that drove me in a direction was the opening workshop of the Developmental Language Disorders Center at UCL, which was the lab opened by Heather van der Lilly at that time. So she had an opening workshop where she invited lots of highly interesting people, some of which are named here on the left-hand side. They were the ones who talked about the genetic underpinnings of language, basically, in 2002. So this was a very preliminary stage. But this really opened my eyes again, because I thought, oh, now we have the human genome sequence, we know something about genetics, and the tools are becoming available to actually investigate the genetic basis of language ability and the genetic basis of cognition. So this is extremely exciting, because this will allow us to answer some of the questions raised in Rethinking Innateness in a new way. So I really got excited by this early genetic research. And indeed, a few years later, I embarked in it. I decided to set up my own genetic study on dyslexia in France, so involving a number of collaborators. First, a geneticist from the Institut Pasteur, Thomas Bourgeron, a wide range of collaborators in various hospital units in France who would recruit the participants. And we integrated this French project into a European network that was led by Gerd Schulte-Körner. And later, this European network even merged with a worldwide consortium, which is called GenLang, and which is led by Simon Fisher. Because so in the French project, we had gathered the samples, the DNA samples and the phenotypes of a few hundred participants, but this was, as you know, not enough to do serious genetics. Except for finding the odd multiplex family, as we did with this one, which was really fun to study. But otherwise, if you want to do genome-wide association studies, you need much larger sample size. So in the European network, we had gathered data on 2,000 participants, and we thought that was large, but obviously that was not large enough to carry out well-powered genome-wide association studies. And this is why later, we gathered forces basically with everybody in the world who had genetic data and language phenotypes in the same participants, hence this GenLang consortium. And it is only these days that the first papers, the first well-powered genome-wide association studies of dyslexia and language skills are being published. So this shows how, I mean, how long-term an investment this was to be starting a genetics project in 2006 and to see the rewards coming only in 2021 and on. But I suppose that's the way of genetics these days. And finally, I will mention another area of my research, which is the most recent turn in my career. It's interesting that in my career, I have never remained focused on one particular topic very long. I always got interested in new topics, from language acquisition to dyslexia to social cognition and autism to genetics, and now to epidemiology, basically, which is the studying cognitive development in a different way from the traditional experimental psychology standards. And so here we've, thanks to Hugo Per, who's another of my former students and who has a public health background, we started exploiting the data from cohorts of children that were followed from birth into adulthood, and on which a wealth of data has been gathered. So in France, we've been working with 2 cohorts, Eden and Elf, and we've also been exploiting the data from the education ministry, the French education ministry, such as those DEP panels. And lately I've been involved in the national evaluations of first grade children in France, which is an exhaustive study. So we have 800,000 participants per points of data collection. And of course, as you may know, there are lots of other big data available all over the world, other cohorts in children and in adults, and they are available very easily or at a very low price. So this is an immense opportunity for people to ask new questions on cognitive development. If you're interested in that approach, you can read this paper below, where we basically summarize our research program. And finally, to move on to the non-scientific aspects of my career, which have been mentioned by Valérie and Dominique, hence the slightly unusual format of this symposium. Of course, as scientists, we always want to make ourselves useful. That's perfectly normal. And we are reassured by the fact that just being a scientist and producing knowledge, doing science, is already useful in itself. Just producing knowledge, even if we don't see the immediate application of this knowledge, we know that it's useful. And so this is enough already. But of course, we can also want to do a bit more than this. So we do a bit more by teaching and by communicating science, obviously. And some of us work in areas that may have a more direct impact on society. And so it turns out that the research in which I got since my PhD, like on child development, on cognitive and brain disorders, on education, this is obviously research that is of very broad interest to everyone in society, and that has a more direct impact on society than much more theoretical research. And so this incited me to try and do a bit more, and to use this knowledge that I had developed on child development and on developmental disorders to help people. Obviously, this was not my initial motivation. When I started working on dyslexia and autism, my initial motivation was purely scientific. I wanted to use those disorders as pathological models of cognition and cognitive development because this was a very fruitful approach, and that's perfectly fine. But at the same time, as you work with children with dyslexia, as you talk with parents of children with autism, while you hear about their problems, you see their difficulties, the difficulties that they face when they have to look for a good professional, when they have to deal with institutions. You see all the massive difficulties that they can have at the institutional level. And so, of course, you want to do a bit more. And so the natural way for me was to offer my scientific expertise to those people, both to patients, to families, to associations. This has been mentioned by Valérie and by Dominique, and to the government when they were willing to listen to me. And I found this extremely rewarding to be able to offer this help, because associations, you know, they always want more from the government, and the government is always a bit tired of listening to them and say, oh yeah, people with autism, they're never satisfied, they always want more, and so on. And so it's very important to help them to formulate their demands in such a way that is evidence-based, that is really well-grounded in the science, that is not completely extravagant and unrealistic. And this is the sort of expertise that I could offer. And so in many different ways that have been described before, I've been trying to do that. And so to conclude this this talk, the lessons that I would draw, or the take-home message for the listeners, would be that first, science is teamwork. Everything that I've done, I've never done it alone. I've done it thanks to my mentors, thanks to also to collaborators. So like when I started the dyslexia study that involved testing in the visual domain, in the auditory domain, in the motor domain. I knew nothing in these areas, and I had to immediately go out and look for the best collaborators in these domains to help me set up the best possible study. So you need good mentors, not only to train you, but also to set you on the right career path, which is very important for the rest of the careers. Having good students is also extremely important, and in my experience, it has made a big difference. Whether you have excellent students that actually push you forward, or whether you have to take them by the hands and pull them, it makes a big difference to your career. And I have really been blessed by very good students. Also, in my experience, changing research areas can be quite fruitful, because you look at the literature with a new eye, with a fresh perspective. It has been fruitful for me. I'm not saying that everybody should do it, because it has costs as well, but it's an interesting strategy. And finally, I think that there are many ways to have an impact as a scientist, from the traditional just doing science and teaching and communicating to the more engaged ways that I have illustrated. So to conclude, I'd like to thank again my mentors, Jacques Miller and Ute Frith, people who have supported me in my early career, whose name is nowhere, but they actually wrote letters and supported me in different ways, and that was also very important. Of course, the institutions that have funded my work, my sponsors for this nomination to the Elman Prize, Ute Frith and Stan de Haan, the Cognitive Science Society, and in particular Nora Newcomb, the chair of the selection committee, and Bob Glushko, who funded this prize. I'm also grateful to him. The symposium participants, Baudouin, Marie, Valérie, Dominique, thank you very much for your nice words. And finally, a selection of my former students and postdocs who have really done all the work I have exposed here. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Franck. I think this last talk illustrated very well the notions of scientific achievement and community building, and that have been reflected in all the symposium. If you have questions, please go to the microphone, or if people online want to ask questions, I can read them here. We have a few minutes for questions. Maybe one of the panelists wants to ask a question to another one. I think there was many content and possible place for discussion. Yes?
Just a quick question. I wanted to know what's your opinion on gender differences in autism diagnostics. So I come from Buenos Aires. In our community, there is a push for diagnostics. And from the community, there is this notion that most of the tools are biased towards diagnosing males. And we should be rethinking the tools so we can properly target the population. I was wondering whether you think there is an innate bias, a gender bias, or it's a diagnostics bias.
Okay, that's an interesting question. I'm going to say right from the start that I don't have a very strong opinion on this. For sure, I think that there is a clear sex difference in autism as well as in most neurodevelopmental disorders. I have not done the epidemiology of autism myself, but I have done the epidemiology of dyslexia, and in a population-based approach, so without any possible referral, diagnostic bias, and so on, we still find that there's about 1.5 boy for 1 girl diagnosed with dyslexia. And I think this is absolutely objective. And I think this is the same in autism spectrum disorder, and even more so with a higher male-female ratio in autism spectrum disorder. So there may be biases against the diagnosis of autistic females. That's perfectly possible, but I would be very surprised if it could explain entirely the sex ratio that we know of. That will be my answer.
I would have a question maybe for Marie about to what extent you think that the visual attention span thing in dyslexia might account for the overlap between dyslexia and ADHD.
So yeah,
and maybe Franck might have an opinion on that too. So I would like to hear you both on that, if you can.
So I know that, so when we look at dyslexia and visual attention, then there is a lot of different theories, again, that are looking into these visual attention deficits, and the visual attention span, as I try to say in the talk, is really something that is specific to this simultaneous distribution of endogenous attention. And I think that in ADHD, what I'm more aware of is there is another network of these attentional centers that should be involved, more like a dorsal network, temporal-parietal junction, maybe more frontal aspects also. So we've tried to control for these problems in the kids we've tested when we looked at their visual attention span. And it seems that the visual attention span is not fully overlapping, at least with ADHD symptoms. But yeah, I mean, we need to do further research on that. I don't know if Franck has some opinion on this.
No, I don't have more to add on this. I think you have done the studies. I haven't. But yeah, I would tend to agree that what this visual attention span captures is not exactly the same kind of problems or symptoms that people with ADHD have.
Okay, thank you. We have another.
Hi, Franck. It's Paul Smolinski. Congratulations on your extremely well-earned award and all the magnificent contributions we heard about today. I have a high-level kind of meta question, which is, scientists are not trained to do all the kinds of public outreach and political activism that we heard about. Personally, I am clueless about how one could be successful in doing that. Obviously, you have been successful, and maybe it's an impossible question to answer, but have you learned anything that might help other people in being more effective in having impact outside of academia?
Hi, Paul. Thanks for being here and for this question. Honestly, I don't know if I can say something useful. I think some of us are gifted for some of those tasks, and some of us have an inclination for them, and some of them don't. And I think it's fine, because there would be no point in having 100% of scientists trying to be all over the place in the media and in governments. That would be far too many. So I think it's enough if we rely on self-selection, basically. I obviously had a taste for this, and I engaged in it really willingly, and I continue to enjoy it. But I think that's perfectly okay if not every scientist does it. We just want to have a critical mass of people who engage with the public discussion. That will be enough, I would say.
And do you think we have that?
Possibly not enough, or at least in certain areas. I mean, definitely in France, I was feeling a bit alone when I was lobbying on the case of autism, for example. But for example, to tell an anecdote, one reason I started in this area was that I noticed that the psychiatrists I knew, who had exactly the same ideas as me, all the medical doctors, they said nothing, because they were kind of bound. They were bound by their clinical duties and by their obligations to communicate smoothly with all the health professionals, and they were not allowed to say something too provocative. And I thought, well, okay, I'm not a medical doctor. I don't have any of those duties, obligations, constraints. I am perfectly free. I can say whatever I want. And so I just realized that and started to use my freedom. So this is one example to show that we are not all equal in our power and in our capacity to say some things and to take some stances and to make some things change. And so, yeah, it's up to each of us to seize the opportunities that we have.
Thank you.
Thank you. And maybe we have time for the last question, if anyone wants to jump in. So, Franck, what would you think or want to be the next debate to be involved in?
Well, I don't know about the next debate, but at the moment, as has been evoked earlier, I'm highly involved in trying to improve education, at least in France. So I've moved into the area of evidence-based education, and I've become part of this scientific council for the National Education Ministry in France. And we're really struggling to try and put the entire education system on a slightly more scientific basis. And it's a very difficult task indeed. So I think this is a very good challenge for the next 10 years.
Thank you. So I think it's the end of our symposium. Thank you, everyone. Congratulations, Franck, again, for this achievement. Thank you to our panelists, Valérie, Dominique, Marie, and thank you, everyone, for attending and for your attention. So goodbye, everyone.
Thank you to all of us. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you, Franck. Thank you, Baudouin.
Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bonnes vacances.
Merci, à bientôt.